and when it comes to the movies I watch on the channel, I've dabbled in the worlds of strange hillbilly-loving, stomach-churning stories, over-enthusiastic children's entertainers, and downright depraved tales. So when I tell you that today's movie is probably the one that affected me the most, I hope you can understand just how truly twisted it must really be. Today's movie is named Trauma. Not for any thematic reasons, no. It's named Trauma because once you're done watching it, you're left with severe lifelong trauma of your own. It's an exploitation movie that takes it upon itself to exploit you personally. And you thought Marley and Me was bad. And while it does have something to say, it deals with the very real, literal crimes against humanity during the Chilean dictatorship and the after effects that something like that may leave behind. It doesn't want these atrocities forgotten to history, but let's not forget, its highest priority is pure shock. So if you thought my videos on a Serbian film, Martyrs, A Human Centipede 2 and Saulo were a bit too much, then maybe you should consider skipping this one, as it's certainly not going to be a fun time. And I do mean that. But before that, let me thank today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, for saving me from the trauma of not being able to pay my rent this month. YouTube really doesn't like horror movies. There are 7.5 billion humans in the world that could be playing Raid right now, so why not join? Let's talk about Raid's new faction, the Sylvan Watchers. The Sylvan Watchers made their home in the Mistwood, a huge jungle in the east of Teleria. If the beasts don't kill you, the Sylvan probably will for trespassing on their land. They have a city open to outsiders called Nyrisa, and they made friends with the neighbouring Shadowkin and Dwarf factions. That's why these factions are all in the Nyrisan Union Alliance in-game. Take a look at some of the favourites. There's a lot of character variety in the faction, with each champion being in tune with nature in a cool and unique way. Raid's prepared something special for all new players this Christmas. Download Raid Shadow Legends from the links below, copy your player ID from in-game, and then go to 12daysofraid.polarium.com. Enter your player ID and then set out on a fun festive adventure that lasts 12 days, running from December 19th to January 10th. Each day, experience a new chapter of this wintry story and play a new minigame for a chance to win some in-game real-life prizes, including holiday-themed Raid champions and even Amazon gift cards with up to $1,000. Existing Raid players head over to the same link, where you can find a special holiday promo code that everyone can use for a small festive gift. So new players, use my link or scan the QR code on screen and get a free starter pack with this in-game loot. MMA and pro wrestling star Ronda Rousey has made an exciting leap into the world of Raid. You can get Ronda by simply opening Raid on 7 days before February the 20th. Use the promo code RAIDRONDA to get a bunch of useful items to help level her up. Just use the promo code in-game and all goodies will be sent straight to your inbox. The movie begins in Chile in 1978. We see as a woman is restrained to a chair, covered in blood and surrounded by soldiers, as the occasional screams of other women in the distance come to a sudden and harsh end after the sound of a gunshot rings throughout the building. We see who appears to be the leader of this operation, and he orders his men to bring a young boy into the room. It's the woman's son, Juan. The man then has the boy restrained and injects something into Juan, as he then refers to him as his dad. Talk about a toxic home life. The father then forcibly removes the son's trousers, slices open his face, and then forces him onto his mother, as the soldier then repeatedly pushes him onto her. And while the soldier is still forcing him onto his mother, the father pulls out a gun and shoots her in the back of the head, all the while forcing the son to continue. Yeah, I did warn you. As horrific as all of this actually is, what's even worse is that according to the director of the movie, Lucio Rojas, in an interview with Thrill Kill, everything is based on real events. The sadism and brutality that we show on screen even fall short of what really happened in Chile. In the dictatorship, torture and abuses were executed that far surpass what we have in this film, which on the one hand is incredibly hard to imagine, especially compared to what you've just witnessed, while on the other hand, being not that hard to imagine at all when you take into account that humans are a plague on this planet. It then skips ahead to 2011 as we see a couple enjoying themselves a little bit more consensually, like really enjoying themselves. Here, have some excessive nudity to go along with your excessive violence. I'm sure 90% of this video is just going to be one big blur. Unless you're a Patreon or YouTube member, then none of it will be blurred. Wink wink. Next morning, the women, Camilla and Julia, get a knock at the door from their friend Magdalena, as their other friend and Camilla's sister, Andrea, waits for them out in the car. They're going on a weekend trip away from the city and plan to drive out into the countryside to stay at Camilla and Andrea's uncle's home to party for the weekend. And as they begin to drive towards their weekend getaway, it then cuts to some kind of compound where we see a man having a very different kind of party, as he appears to be dissolving a fetus in acid before pouring it through a hole in the floor. The women eventually arrive at a rundown bar out in the countryside and stop to ask for directions, and as they do just that, they're almost immediately approached by two aggressive men, like vultures surrounding their prey. But as soon as an older gentleman stands up and gives them a look, without hesitation, they back down and quickly get out of the women's way. They then get the directions from the bartender, only after the assertive older man gives his approval, before they thank the man for his assistance and leave. And on their way out of the bar, Magdalena meets a little girl named Yoya, and she gives her two little finger puppets so that she'll never be alone. And just before they leave, they're approached by two local police officers, a younger officer named Pedro and a slightly older one named Diego, the only two police officers that can be found for miles. So with that in mind, Pedro warns the women about the men in the bar, saying that they're not exactly used to seeing women like them, as if that's a valid reason to be a complete creep, and gives Andrea his number, just in case the women need help with anything. They then make it to the beautiful private house that they're staying in, just as it cuts away from this picturesque looking villa to a dark, depressing room, as we see a man eating an equally depressing looking meal before getting up to approach a crying woman and returning with a chunk of her flesh. The same man then stares at himself in the mirror and touches a scar across his face, indicating that it's the young boy Juan from the beginning who has now grown up, and has a permanent reminder etched into the flesh of his face to remind him of the horrific acts that occurred the day that he was given that scar. It's almost as if it was put there deliberately by his father. Not just another act of cruelty by an incredibly sadistic man, but a way to ensure that he can never escape these horrors. He wants them permanently and deeply etched into his mind until the day he dies. And then in a flashback, we see that the beginning of this movie wasn't just some kind of isolated incident either, as Juan's father is forcing him to horrifically assault a newborn baby, almost as if his father is deliberately trying to condition him. Its sick and disturbing nature is almost carried out as if it's some kind of thought-out lesson, rather than just a spur-of-the-moment act of depravity. Juan's father is really trying to create something. This is all thought out, and as if that wasn't heartbreaking enough, it then cuts back to the present, as we then see Juan with his own son Mario. The disturbing cycle is continuing, as the pair have a woman and her newborn child held captive, and as the woman cries out for her baby, Mario loses it and brutally beats the woman to death as the infant cries out in the same room. Back with the women. Later that night, they're settling into their new weekend residence, and as they're drinking, dancing and having fun, the building suddenly loses power. Magdalena and Julia decide to head out behind the house to fix the fuse box, but when they're out there, they both begin kissing each other, right as Camilla, Julia's girlfriend, is sitting in the house next to them. And to make matters even worse, Camilla's sister Andrea, already disliking Julia, witnesses the entire thing. But with the overall tone of this movie already being quite apparent, something tells me Julia's infidelity is soon to be the least of her worries. And in a way, this scene aims to somewhat subvert your expectations of where this is going to go. There's been subtle underlying hints of Andrea not exactly liking Julia, right up until she literally says that she doesn't like her. But it's a facade. We're about to be seeing very quickly that this movie is going to be going 100 miles per hour in a completely different direction. And by the time you finish and reflect on it, you'll wonder why this subplot was even a thing after all. Back at Juan and Mario's compound, we see Mario giving food to a woman who he refers to as his mother, which isn't too unlikely considering the circumstances surrounding Juan's own mother and her treatment by his father, so it's not exactly surprising that he didn't develop healthy habits and a loving, nurturing family environment, made extremely evident by Mario proceeding to bark at his mother like a totally normal person, before engaging in fellatio with his own father like a totally not normal person. Back with the women, Andrea looks on in disdain as Julia kisses Camilla before she removes her clothes and begins to dance for them all. But suddenly, she looks and notices that Juan is watching her through the window, who she refers to as the old man from the bar, meaning that what sick and depraved things Juan gets up to aren't simply restrained to the comfort of his decaying compound. His reputation alone is enough to make a bar full of grown men terrified at the sight of him, which now makes sense why the bartender only gave the women directions after Juan's approval. The bartender knew exactly what would be waiting out there for them, but had absolutely no other option but to send them into his clutches as he was stood right there observing them. A note is then slid under the door saying welcome, before calmly and casually, Juan lets himself into the property, and Mario follows from behind, taking the women's keys. Without as much as saying a word, he enters as this commanding presence. He then gives a subtle nod to himself, almost as if he's saying that this will do just nicely, before sitting down with Mario and placing a gun on his crotch, where he tells the women to continue dancing. The tension in the air is so thick that you could almost cut it, but suddenly, like the flip of a switch, Juan's calm and calculated demeanour completely shifts as he goes from being fairly nonchalant about the situation to screaming in Julia's face for her to continue dancing, indicating to the women that sudden and extreme acts of violence are very capable from this man. He instructs her to strip for him before forcing his tongue into Magdalena's mouth. But unfortunately for the women, the calm before the storm has already passed, and he violently hits Andrea to the floor, and she lays there in a dazed and rattled state, unable to defend her sister from these horrific men as they begin to violently rip the clothes from Camilla and Magdalena and brutally assault them in a scene that doesn't feel like it's ever going to end. Mario then bites a chunk out of Magdalena's face like some kind of rabid dog, and once he's done, he kicks her and decides to inflict even more physical pain by pouring salt all over her fresh wound. And after they're both done, engaging in this absolutely horrific father-son activity, they decide to sit down on the couch to bond by making out with each other. Later on, after the brutal assault has come to an end, the women are restrained up against a wall, and Magdalena spits on Juan. But let's not forget that this is the same guy who makes out with his own son, so of course he wipes it up and devours it like a 5-star meal. And once the night has passed, she's able to break free from her restraints and pick up the gun from the coffee table as both Mario and Juan sleep. But as she aims the gun at them and pulls the trigger, she discovers that it isn't loaded. So instead, she decides to take the keys and her phone and begins to head out the front door. But instead of leaving, in her shocked and traumatized state, she stops to look at herself in the mirror before deciding to put the gun in her mouth. But Juan, being the type of guy to like things to be done properly, beats her to the punch and shoots her from behind, blowing out her brains in the process. And just like that, the pair get up and leave. And as they do, Andrea manages to break free from her restraints and places a towel over Magdalena's body, conveniently forgetting to cover her face that now looks like 3-day-old spaghetti bolognese. Further emphasizing that Juan killed Magdalena for purely no reason than he wanted to, he even leaves the women with their phones, allowing Andrea to call Pedro's number, with Juan being so nonchalant about the entire thing, he even stands in direct clear view of Pedro as he drives towards the women. After arriving to assess the scene, Pedro somehow being unaware of this pretty important information, despite being one of only 2 police officers in what could be hundreds of miles, that according to Diego, Juan usually only ever kills locals to not bring attention from the outside world, and that everybody lets him do it because they're too afraid to confront him. It's not exactly explained as to why Pedro doesn't know this information, as he's clearly familiar enough with the area to know about the locals at the bar, but for some reason doesn't know the old dude who's been brutally offing people since the 70s. But that aside, it's almost as if Juan knows that Pedro isn't going to let this go, as we then see him meet the little girl Yoya that Magdalena gave the finger puppets to earlier, before a frantic crying man then flags down the officer's car with the women in the back, stating that Juan has taken his daughter. Even this guy knows who Juan is. Come on, Pedro. They arrive at the bar and arm the father and his son with guns, and they enter to find Juan alone, with no sign of Yoya anywhere. And right here is a turning point in the movie, where things go from being about the pure and utter depravity of what humans can be capable of based on their upbringing, to some pretty standard, if not goofy, B-movie action, with a bit of gore thrown in for good measure. We see this as Juan pretends to give himself up, and as Diego approaches to place him in handcuffs, Juan thrusts a knife through his skull and somehow uses his body as a human shield, despite there being quite literally 3 other people in the same room as him, simultaneously firing in his direction. So after dodging the barrage of bullets like some kind of Chilean John Wick, he throws the knife through the father's neck, punches Pedro in the face, kicks the son, who's too busy wondering why his dad's leaking all of a sudden. He spits in the father's face for daring to want his daughter back, before pulling the knife through his neck and planting it into his son's leg. He then retrieves a machete and proceeds to brutally hack off the son's arm with it, and is moments away from being shot by Pedro before Mario enters the room and shoots him instead. And once they're done in there, Juan then exits the bar carrying Yoya in one hand and a severed head in the other. But just like before, he shows no actual interest in the women anymore, and even unlocks the car for them to get out. Because it seems that for Juan, it's not just about the killing. He's clearly very capable of it, and there's no obvious reason as to why he doesn't just get it over and done with, so it would seem that the torment and mental torture these women will suffer is enough reason to keep them alive in his mind. That, or he simply is just so twisted that he genuinely doesn't care. Which, yeah, is also a very real possibility. He got what he wanted from them, and now he's throwing them aside like trash, without so much as a second thought. After watching him walk down the road with Yoya, the women then enter the bar to find the carnage left behind and discover that Pedro is in fact still alive, as luckily, or unluckily I guess, the bullet went right through without hitting any major organs. With Juan, once again leaving behind a trail of utter destruction, the group realise that they're so far away from help that they simply don't have enough time to go and get it. So knowing what kind of things Juan and Mario will do to Yoya, purely for their own amusement, they decide that the only thing they can do is to go and get her themselves. Before we then see that in Juan's compound, Mario's mother, one of the women that are being held captive, is also Juan's sister. Now I'm getting wrong turn flashbacks, which does make sense considering his father's own relationship with women, because if he was willing to do the things he did to Juan's own mother, then it wouldn't be that far-fetched to imagine that he kept his daughter locked up too, and now Juan is just continuing to do that. And although, despite her clearly being a prisoner, at least in this scene, he seems to show what could almost be described as compassion towards her, as he calmly and politely talks to her while bringing her food, before telling her that he's brought her someone, and that she can now be a mother again, before unlocking her shackles for her. It then cuts back to another flashback of a younger Juan, as the compound is under attack. The chaos of gunfire is erupting all around him, as his father scolds him about defending his position like a man, before he then stands out in the open, firing back at the attackers without a second thought about his own safety, which further solidifies the fact that this man doesn't just have some sort of evil agenda, he's outright insane. Being big-headed enough to think you can stop a bullet doesn't make you tough, it makes you a fool, and a fool is exactly what he is. As Juan watches as his father's magical bulletproof force field fails him and he's executed right before his very eyes. His father dying in the exact same way his mother died. Except, minus all the, well, the attackers find Juan cowering, but it's clear that they're here to liberate and to put an end to his tyrant of a father, as they don't harm him and even show concern for the young man before asking if there are any other people nearby. Juan directs them where to go, but as their backs are turned on him, he cuts the throat of one, disembowels another, and shoots the third, all while having a flashback within his flashback about torturing a woman with his father. It doesn't matter that these people came to save people like Juan. The damage has already been done. Through sheer trauma, his father was able to condition him to become exactly what he wanted. Back in the present, we see the four of them breaking into the compound armed with weapons, before they split up as one of the men approaches. Pedro and Camilla find an alive but incredibly mangled woman restrained to a wall, while Julia and Andrea find Mario and decide that they need to distract him so they can get to him. Julia takes off her clothes, and as he's distracted by this, Andrea bashes him over the head and decides to restrain him instead of outright killing him, which would go a long way in evening the odds for them. But after meeting back up with the others, we learn that their reasoning for keeping him alive is so they can use him as leverage to trade for Yoya. But considering that Juan's the type of guy who was raised witnessing his mother be executed by his own father, for proceeding to subject his sister to a life of captivity and assault, something tells me that Juan won't be interested in a trade. Which is exactly what happens, because all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a person begins running towards the group, with what appears to be a stick of dynamite up their behind, and after they make their rather explosive entrance, Juan appears at the doorway, aiming a gun at them. They lock themselves in another room, but Juan begins to fill it with gas, and appears at the top of the stairs wearing a gas mask while armed with a rifle. Pedro's hit by one of the shots, quickly followed by Camilla, but Andrea and Julia drag Camilla away, leaving Pedro's face to horrifically melt off from the gas as Juan saves his son. Mario, who's all of a sudden made a miraculous recovery, suddenly appears before knocking Andrea to the floor and throwing Julia out of the window to her death below. and as he's about to begin beating Camilla with a crowbar, Andrea stabs him in the foot, and then begins violently beating his genitals with a brick. After Andrea and Camilla leave, Juan finds Mario, beaten but clearly still alive, and after deciding that his human-sized fleshlight is no longer of use to him anymore, he puts him down like an injured dog. They then hear Juan singing to Julia as she fell to her not-so-apparent death, so they go back to look for her. They find Juan standing over her as she's chained to a post, before he then rips her jaw from her face with a crowbar, causing Camilla to jump on his back. He gets her to the floor, but just as he manages to do so, Andrea fires 3 shots into his back, before giving him 1 more as a special bonus just for him. Camilla lays there, dying from the bullet wound she took earlier, as Andrea goes on to find the little girl. But instead what she finds is a crib in the middle of a room with a baby in it. She then finds the aunt's sister mother, but leaves her there after hearing Camilla scream, and returns to find her gone. After a bit of searching, she finds her sister dead, before Juan, the walking bullet sponge, punches her in the back of the head and stabs her in the foot and the leg. But after Juan blocks a bullet with a piece of hardened Chilean brickwork, Andrea shoots some conveniently placed beakers of acid that showers him in an extremely corrosive substance that proceeds to corrode his entire face. We then see the ex-aunt sister mother getting up to leave with Yoya before it cuts to Andrea pointing a gun at the baby. And just as the police backup finally arrives at the scene, she pulls the trigger after saying, "You are going to be just like them," before finding herself riddled with a barrage of bullets, in the process kind of misinterpreting what this movie has been teaching us about Juan. Sure, the movie's called Trauma, and it's essentially saying that the trauma creates an endless cycle, with the victims going on to become the predators, but it seems almost contrary to what this movie has been deliberately showing us through the flashbacks. It's trying to emphasize that Juan wasn't born a monster. In the very beginning, he resisted his father. He was turned into one through the countless horrific acts that he was forced to partake in. It even makes somewhat of a point to emphasize that some time has passed with him and his father, as he goes from this fresh-faced looking young kid to a slightly older teenager or young man who's now grown slight facial stubble. But maybe that isn't the point at all. That could mean absolutely nothing. Maybe it's supposed to be an inescapable rollercoaster of constant brutality and savagery to mirror the very real atrocities committed during the very real dictatorship that left way over 3,000 dead or missing, with tens of thousands being subjected to absolutely horrific acts of torture. I'm not trying to justify or glamorize this movie in any way, but maybe it just doesn't want you to forget. So I'm sure as you've seen with me covering a movie as downright horrific as this, a lot of this video has had to be censored. But if you're interested in seeing the uncensored, uncut versions of all my videos, you can by joining up to be either a Patreon or YouTube member, getting access to the unrestricted videos, while simultaneously supporting the channel and getting a shout out, as apparently with each passing day, YouTube seems to be making it harder and harder to produce content like this. And talking about YouTube members and patrons, I'd like to finish this video off by giving a big thank you to all of you guys. So starting off with the YouTube members, a huge thank you to Laurie Resendez, Billy Bad Cables, Gary Braunbeck, Psycho, Cobe Redbeam, Ex Gerticus, Mike Violic, Cyan's Gaming, Goobs AU, JulieNot666, David Gailanas, Volter, Brian Walker, David Winter, Donovan Farrell, Mr. Devneals, Roni2135, Alexander Jablinski, Ruben Cardenas, Jacob Walkentin, Cal Ballinger, and Juno. And moving over to Patreon, a massive thank you to Dom, Rebecca Pitts, Benz, Martin Brannan, Jared C. Bees, Pascal Mathis, Macy J, Chris, Dennis, Jerry McSendy, Ashley L. Wintz, Christopher Butsky, Joshua Torres, Remy, Fire Goes Fast, Dyreem, Dark Shiva, Josh Hannon, Billy Whitaker, Jay Slows, Daniel Dickinson, G-Source, Fatty Ghost, Miguel, Owen, Mackenzie Riley, Bryson, John Smith, Madrick, Lyru, Stephen Weber, Channing Mars, Michael Attikpa, Benjamin Bronson, Paul Bartlett, Reese Heinrich, Toast is Hot 1, Nazdan, Todd, Benedict Garam, FX666, AJ Castro, Robbie Walk, Nate Law, Scorpexi, Ethan Holmes, DeAndre Fernandez, Mitch Brandman, Blooper Bros, Averages 2, Augustina, Cedric Spear, Salome Rios, Matthias Jensen, Sergei Maslavosky, John Edano, Clodar, Fake Tom Jones, Giovanni Montahano, Patrick Ferrara, Jono, Dave McDade, Skeleton Bonelord, Kevin Zust, Madison B, Joe, David Kavanagh, and Bicey Cloptopod. So once again, a massive thank you to all YouTube members and patrons, and a huge thank you to everyone else for watching.